Welcome to day 3 of the 16th Vermont Organics Recycling Summit. We are holding this summit this year in conjunction with International Compost Awareness Week, which is the largest education and outreach program of the composting industry. It's organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's theme is Recipe for Regeneration Compost. And I am Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I would like to start by giving a huge thank you to all of our fabulous sponsors, without whom we would not be able to make this full program freely available to everybody. So thanks to them. Those include Community Bank, Eco Products, Vegware, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, Vermont Natural Ag Products, AgriLab Technologies, Compost Manufacturing Alliance, EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, Vermont Produce Program from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and Wasted, Separating Waste, Connecting Communities. We are at the Financing Your Compost Business session today here at 3 p.m., Alternatives and Best Practices. And just before I turn it over to Linda, our presenter, I want to give a quick reminder that the program does continue tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with Food, Fiber, and Functioning Ecosystems, Vermont's Journey to Pay for Ecosystem Services, and 1 p.m. the ins and outs of on-farm composting. That will be followed tomorrow afternoon by a tour of Lamoille Soil Compost Facility up in Johnson. I say up because it's north of me, but maybe down for some of you. That registration is still open. I just want to remind folks that that is actually a separate registration than the regular summit registration. So if you are interested in that, just pop over to our website and you can register for that tour still. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce Linda, who is our speaker today. Linda is Director of Advocacy and Chapter Relations for the U.S. Composting Council. So it's great to have you here. And folks, just so you know, you can put your questions into the chat box at any time, but we are going to be holding those to the end of Linda's presentation. But you don't have to hold your questions, just go ahead and populate them in there. And then we'll have plenty of time for going over the Q&A and having some good discussion after her presentation. Linda, welcome.
So thanks, Natasha, for having me. I remember I was just thinking about, it was this time 2 years ago, I think you guys had the first virtual conference that I remember attending when COVID hit. And I remember how great of a job you did and how wonderful it was to hear presentations when I felt so isolated. So yeah. I'm glad that continues to work for you all. So today I'm going to talk to you about one big piece we're working on when it comes to infrastructure, which is the financial side for both individual compost manufacturers and for the industry. I'm going to try to address both sides. But our core members are manufacturers, so that is why this is one thing we're very focused on. So if you don't know us, probably most of you do, but we have been 30 years in the business of promoting, teaching, and otherwise supporting the commercial composting industry. We do support backyard composting in terms of a practice, as well as the full food waste hierarchy, including reduce food waste, feed people, feed animals, all of those things. But our piece is commercial composting, and we try to balance our focus on all scales. So that's our mission. And we have, I would say at this moment, we're actually a little bit higher than the number of members you see there, representing about 2,500 individuals, who are everything from about half of the group being municipal or private sector compost facility representatives. And then we have people who are in the academic industry, researchers. We have affiliates who are suppliers, and advocates, a growing bank of advocates in the industry who are joining as individual members. So that's who we are. So I wanted to set some context before I got launching into this. and to let you know that these are our classic hurdles that we have seen, the big buckets of things that are impeding infrastructure growth. Because for the last 3 to 4 years, we've been super focused on this because we hear from people, we want access to composting facilities in our community. So we've done member surveys, we have done anecdotal research, we've done member research, and these are the areas that we think are the biggest blockages, starting on the left. The lack of public education and outreach on a national scale. There's lots of great programs out there, but there isn't a national focus. And we're just getting a corporate supported national awareness program off the ground in terms of messaging and who we're going to focus on to address that. State permitting and legislation. Not all states have great not that the regulators are the problem, but great regulations. So there are states that still are behind in terms of keeping up with the changing industry. And we've actually updated our 2012 tiered system for compost facility regulation at the state level, and that's just going to come out in June. We've added in some provisions for community composting and for some feedstocks that were not a thing, so to speak, in 2012. So you'll be hearing about that soon. And hopefully we'll see more states adopting those regulations, more and more starting to talk about it and get their regs up to speed. And that will help us close infrastructure gaps. Last year I was here talking about our zoning project, and that is completed. And we do have a model zoning template for cities and towns to use, modify to their cultural, political realities. That is at compostingcouncil.org/zoning. And we're going to be rolling that out at some conferences where there are county elected officials and people of that, not our traditional group, because those are the people we need to talk to get the zoning ordinances changed so that when composters come knocking at the door, they don't have to change the zoning as well as site a facility. Contamination. Over the summer, we had a big, last year, we had a big summit about contamination and came out with a compostable products decision-making guide so that compost manufacturers can take a look at the factors in their region and in their business model and make the decision whether compostable products is something they wanted to take in terms of their food waste collection. And then lastly, the big hurdle that we've seen is financing, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So we have also done surveys through our Target Organics hub, and what that effort is it's turned into is online. It's hub.compostingcouncil.org, and that is where municipalities around the country who we surveyed who did not have food scrap composting programs said one of their big needs was to have a centralized place for all kinds of credible compost information. So that's going to be referred to later. So I did want to mention that early. So to get started, like I said, we're going to talk about financing for both at the individual level and at the industry level. So one of the challenges is our industry is still seen in the financial services industry as fragmented and new. Even though some of us have been doing this for a long time, they see different scales of composting, different systems and technologies, different markets, different ways of doing it. And the other big thing is there was no NAICS code, which is the national, oh boy, now that I'm presenting, I forgot what it stands for. National, it's what they use to name industries who are considered bona fide industries. But that has changed. In 2020, we applied to have our NAICS code. We did have a listing under chemical fertilizers, and that was a problem for composters when it came to individuals monetarily, because what it was doing was driving up their insurance rates. It was causing them problems when they filled out for bank loans and other various things where you have to put in your NAICS code. And what they've done is they have created a separate code for compost manufacturing. That's the good news. And one piece of the good news there is that means the Census Bureau annually will be collecting information on the compost industry, on how many compost businesses are out there, what their impact is locally. So a lot of the money we've spent in a large study that's underway right now is going to be spent by our tax money. And that really is a good thing for us. And what we've done is we've appealed. They put us under chemical manufacturing still, even they took us out from under fertilizer. And I believe it's helped in some cases, but not in all cases when it comes to those financial impacts. So we've appealed that and asked to be moved into a category that's now called bio-based products. So, and you never know when you're going to hear yes or no from them. So that was done about 6 months ago, and we haven't heard anything yet. But we do urge everyone to start using the new 325315 code, because that will start to get the data numbers rolling for the Census Bureau. So how do we look at cost of facilities? Those of you who are compost manufacturers in the audience may be trying to apply this to yourself and going, what in the world? Because what we did is we looked at all scales and we tried to settle on what a medium facility would cost in terms of capitalizing and getting it started. So what we settled on was a 50,000 ton per year facility. And 1 to 10 million seems like a really big range, but when you account for the many varying feedstocks that have to be acquired, the market in terms of labor supply and what equipment is costing and what stone is costing, there was such a wide variety when we were asking and collecting this data. And then depending on the scale, you know, you could be between 1 and 10 million, depending if you're on the low end of that medium scale versus the high end. So that is kind of a number we've been using as a kind of a thumbnail sketch number when people come to us, and we get a lot of them now that say, you know, we want to put this into a grant. What does it cost to start a compost facility? And so that's the number that we've been using. So, you know, the other thing, one of the big hurdles is banks, and banks will, you know, just a little example there, looking at some, I forget where we came up with this number, but we were just quizzing some different, it was a couple of counties looking at what their banks were loaning for. And, you know, they might be loaning $1,000 for composting and compared to $8,000 for AD. And then they're so traditionally used to giving a lot of money for solar. So we have to get ourselves moved up in the eyes of the bank, because many banks just do not understand our model. They think we're just out there with shovels, with some piles of dirt. They don't understand the business model. They don't understand the biological process of composting. So, you know, one of the things that when we've asked around and talked about how do new compost manufacturers get loans and get over this information hurdle, we've heard several composters, it's a friendly industry, and they have told us that, you know what, call me, I got a guy. You know, like someone was saying that BB&T in the Southeast, and I think it's in the Mid-Atlantic, that they have people in their system that understand our business model. Someone from A1 told me, you know what, I can give them references to people who understand composting in the banks. So that would be one way to try to break that hurdle down for new composters. I know that larger composters, when they're expanding, I've been told that banks will sometimes ask for a consultant study on the business model, and that's their way of doing the diligence. Most new composters don't have that kind of cash to go out and do that kind of study. So you'll have to rely on people who can help demonstrate your model that they do know. So when it comes to banks, there are a couple of different traditional kinds of financing, and one that people are pretty familiar with is equity financing. And this is where each source gets a share of the profits once the business makes a profit. Now, what that means, though, is that there is a lot of information in order to do these kinds of loans that will be required, because they want to be ensured that you're going to make a profit and that they are going to get their money back, because you don't pay back this loan, the money comes through the shareholders, and they do get they are getting a portion of your business in that sense. So that is one type of financing that's out there from banks. And the other, which maybe many of us are more familiar with, is debt financing, which requires some owner skin in the game. It'll require some pledged assets, some collateral, and oftentimes they will ask for to prove that your cash flow to debt ratio will be something that they can count on. And this is one though where, you know, if you go belly up, that is on your assets. That's where the money comes from if something goes wrong. So that's one of the other common types. And I forgot to mention in the beginning, and I apologize, I should have done that at the very beginning. So what I'm presenting to you is work that was done by a Duke Nicholas School intern. I think I had her on one of the slides and I just glossed right over it. And her name was Laurel Cohen, and she is an environmental economics major. And she went out and surveyed numerous compost manufacturers and numerous regulators and financial people to put this research together. So this is an example. She pulled some case studies out in her paper, which I'm going to tell you about at the end. And this is one of them, Dirt Hugger, which many of you may be familiar with up in Washington State. And this company in 2010, these two partners, Tyler Miller and Pierce Lewis, they brought $26,000 to the table to build what they like to call the black gold mine. And their initial endeavor was for 10,000 tons per year. And they estimated they needed $100,000. So what they did is they took that seed money that they had and they managed to obtain a county recycling grant from their local county. And then they also received some funds from their landlord, and they had another grant competition that was not a government grant competition. It was a small, I believe it was some small kind of a new business grant competition. So that's how they put together their initial funding. Then they had a round two, and I think that came a couple of years later. I don't remember what the year was. I didn't put it in here, but they were looking to elevate up to 35,000 tons per year on a new site. So their goal was $500,000. And this time they went to the county again, the local community, and got some grants. And for the first time, they applied for one of those USDA grants, one of the rural development grants. And they worked with their local community because I believe it required public-private partnership. And then they got money from a very successful, as you can see, Kickstarter campaign. And then on top of that, they did get some bank debt financing. So they have been very, they told Laurel that they were very adamant that they wanted to retain control of their business, and they didn't want to have anything to do with banks or anyone having partial ownership or telling them what to do. So this chart here shows the split of their initial financing that they went for. And they did go for one more round of financing that brought them up to a building where they could then increase their processing to 65,000 tons per year. And this time, years later and many tons later, they were able to get all of that funds from a bank loan. So it kind of shows the growth of a business over time and the types of financing vehicles that they used. So I thought that was a very interesting picture. The next company that I've included here from her case studies is Hoffman Composting, Joe Hoffman in Tennessee. And he also was very adamant about wanting to control his own destiny. So what he did is he put the house on the line, and he took a mortgage loan to get his property. And then he took out a home equity line of credit for his site development. So throughout it all, he had retained ownership of it, but he did say putting the bet on the house is very stressful to the family. So that I'm sure many of you can relate to that if you are in this business. And there's still, none of us, I mean, most of us going into composting, I've not heard of too many rich people going into composting. So most of us do wind up hitting a ceiling on how much capital we can actually afford to loan out of our own pocket. He did actually, a couple of years after that, Tennessee Department of Environmental Conservation, and we'll talk about grants in a minute, but they had a grant their program is great. It actually does focus on equipment and sites. And so he was able to get a loan for a metal Quonset roof. And he said this really upped the game for what he was doing and how the quality of the material that he was processing. So now onto another type of financing vehicle, which is grants. And those can come from specific, foundation grants, or more frequently, you hear about public grants from states, counties, et cetera. And a figure that Laurel had, she interviewed and researched, and she found that state agencies have dispersed over 25 million over the last decade, or last couple of decades, to compost facilities and programs. While that sounds on the face of it like a good number, when you look at that number of what it costs to develop a compost facility, it's just a drop in the bucket. And the state grant programs usually require a match, and government grant committees, she was told in her interviews, that they tend to choose the more established businesses over the new entrepreneurs. So that's one downside of the most government grants. And a lot of times they're developed from surcharges on waste, and that's going to come up in a minute in another slide that I'm going to talk about. So one thing that Dirt Hugger did tell us, going back to that original case study, is they said that they recommend that facilities start with small grants. Start with if you have cities or counties or a nonprofit offering grants, stay at the local level so that you can ask questions and really understand how the grant process works before you start moving up to the federal level and big grants. And they said, watch for grant competitions. There are many more out there than you would ever dream. And I know that Grant Watch that I have the logo there, that's one that I know that you can subscribe to get notified of grants that are coming. But they did say, beware. The paperwork that comes after receiving a grant to fulfill the grant is not something that most compost manufacturers are realizing is coming. Those of us who are in nonprofits and things, we realize that's part of the game, but it's sometimes a surprise. So you may want to talk to people before you apply for one to make sure you think you have the capacity to fulfill all the requirements of the grant after it goes along. So I said I would mention surcharges again. And the reason for that is I wanted to bring in a member and partner to talk about in terms of work on this. So grant programs, sometimes they're made through just legislative allocations. There will be a bill saying they want to put X dollars towards composting or whatever, hopefully composting, or there may be an executive allocation by the governor or the DEC or whatever, or the local county executive, for example. And when Laurel did her research on grant programs, she found that there were 34 states that had some type of grant program. And most of them are coming, as I mentioned earlier, from tipping fee surcharges. And at the same time that Laurel was doing this work, just to show you that great minds think alike, Brenda Platt from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance was starting on a project with an intern there named Sophia Jones. And what they did was focused on the surcharges and the way that the surcharge programs were working in the various states. And this is because Brenda, if you know Brenda, she is all about advocating for compost funds. And she saw real opportunities, especially in Maryland, which I happen to be from Maryland as well, real opportunities where money is desperately needed for shovels in the ground programs. And there is no money at the state level. And these programs in other states where they are putting a tipping fee of anywhere from, I think her report showed tipping fees of anywhere from 50 cents up to like $13 or $14 a ton on landfilled and often transferred waste and on occasion incinerated waste. So this was bringing a good deal of money into these programs. And what her Sophia's report has done, that is on the ILSR website, which I'll give you the link at the end, is shown how these programs are organized. And every state seems to be organizing their program differently in terms of their own political realities and what they could manage to accomplish, whoever was pushing for the program. So there's a lot to be learned about how to design surcharge programs and bills if you need one in your state, or if you need to expand what you already have. There was a bill put in Maryland that Brenda worked with, and the Maryland Composting Council, Maryland DC Composting Council supported. It did not make it through this year because probably it's an election year, but it did put some awareness out there, and there is some hope that next year it may go. It was calling for a $5 fee. And a lot of times these surcharge programs go to a lot of different buckets. They go to recycling, sometimes they'll go to litter prevention, they may go to water pollution programs. So I think that, I think that was one learning that I heard her mention, is that, spreading it around so that different programs can use it can help politically for these programs to stand and make it through the legislature. And a lot of the surcharge programs out there now seem to be focused on funding personnel for counties or programs in counties. So, getting more of those programs to actually finance shovel-ready, site and financing for equipment is one goal that we should really be looking for. So here's a case study of a grant program. Willa D. Constanzo is from Nebraska, the city of Lincoln, and they had a windrow turner facility. And what they wanted to do, they have a yard waste ban in Nebraska a portion of the year, and she wanted to be able to upgrade how much material they could take, and they wanted to convert to an aerated static pile facility. So they received a grant from their state fund, which is from a surcharge program, for doing electrical work and doing some repairs and conversion of their pad over to aerated static pile. And I will let Willa introduce the next type of financing that I'm going to talk about, which is public-private partnerships. And she had said in her interview with Laurel that if a government doesn't like public-private partnerships, they need to take a hard look at themselves because you can't do it alone. I referenced that survey that we did of municipalities through the Target Organics Hub in 2018 and 2019. And one of the big things we heard from municipalities that don't have food scrap composting programs or any composting programs said, we will never be big enough or have the political will to run our own composting program, but we would love to work with the private sector. We heard that in so many cases and comments. So I do believe that this is one of the big futures of the compost industry. And there are different ways it can happen. The private sector can design, build, and operate while the municipality owns the actual land. And that can really help for compost manufacturers because siting is a real challenge when it comes to, finding a piece of land and then finding a piece of land that neighbors aren't upset about. So if you have government owning the land, maybe providing land near a water treatment facility or a landfill or some place that is more acceptable, it can really help the private sector. And then there's also cases where the private sector might provide financing and where they might own the facility initially and transfer it over to the public sector down the line. So there's quite a few models out there. One of the case studies that I included from Laurel's paper is the Ohio Department of Corrections. And this grant program in Ohio, it required the grants to go to public programs or public municipalities. So the corrections department qualified, obviously, as a public program. But what they did when they bought their in-vessel system is they partnered with Barnes Nursery in Ohio, and Barnes Nursery does the hauling and processing of the material and works with the offender workforce to get that material processed. So it's been a very successful program. So coming down the pike here, bonds is another program that municipalities use quite often to fund public projects. They are similar to debt financing. There are obligations to be repaid, but those municipal loans diversify the risk over all of those people that buy bonds. So that is another financing mechanism that's out there. And then there's some that Laurel had found that are very exciting new methods that have traditionally focused more on the energy sector, but we're starting to see attention turning to soils and healthy soils and composting. So green banks are collections. They're not a green bank that's standing, but they are collections of funding from public investors who want to see sustainable projects raised up. And so those are they're increasing around the country. Green bonds is kind of a subset of green banks, and green bonds are actually, I think in 2020, there were $290 billion of green bonds sold, and 61.5 billion of that was in North America. 48% of it was in Europe, where they're a bit ahead of us. And they have criteria and principles for funding these green projects. So this may be another way that we'll see more and more composting projects getting funded. Another interesting emerging method is called outcomes-based financing. And if you all think about it, the classic definition of profit does not include externalities. So the impact that a business has on other parties. So it's not reflected in the value of the goods and services that it produces. So who do we know in this room that meets that definition but compost manufacturers and people in the compost industry? You know, I mean, we provide all of those ecosystem services that really do not come back to us in terms of profit. So one company that works on these kind of financing schemes is called Quantified Ventures. And basically the way they explained it is that what they do is provide upfront capital to pilot a new approach or scale up systems. And then the private investors pay the upfront costs, and later the public sector or institutions who might be financing this, they make the repayment back to the initial investors. So the focus here, though, is on defining outcomes that benefit the public good, and in this case, sustainable ends. So the other thing I wanted to do a little bit, just to give you a little bit of highlights on, is the industry as a whole, ways that we may see some financing coming. Last summer, the Compost Act, which is a federal congressional piece of legislation, was introduced, and I'm sure you heard about it, and it puts the USDA in oversight of a grant and loan guarantee program. And we worked with actually the sponsors of it, and estimated $2 billion would be needed to fulfill the gap of food scrap that needs to be composted, not food scrap that could be eaten, fed to animals or people, or that should be reduced. But we decided to just focus on, I believe it was 13 billion tons that or million tons a year that needed to be composted, and tried to spin that out to how many facilities it would be and what the cost would be. So we estimated $2 billion over 10 years. So the way the program would run is that a portion of that would go through grants to governments, not private sector, public sector. And then the other portion of it would be through loan guarantees to the private sector, to farmers, things like that. And then there is a 25% carve out for small scale projects, community composting projects in that, so that it doesn't all go at one fell swoop to large scale projects. And then the other piece of the Compost Act, and I'm sorry, and here's the eligible projects. So it's just the kind of thing we're talking about: facility planning, permitting, equipment, hardware type issues. And then on-site composting systems and programs and collection programs. And then the other piece of of the Compost Act was to institute composting as a fundable conservation practice under USDA's conservation programs, under their EQUIP program. And this would enable farmers to be paid for using compost because of its carbon sequestration properties, among other things, just like cover crops, crop rotation, et cetera. And since this was introduced, actually, the USDA has named 10 states, and I think Vermont is one of them, in which the NRCS is testing out and adopting this as a practice in that state. And it may get adopted nationally before the end of this year. So this will probably happen either legislatively or through regulation. And I know that Natasha may have things to add about that later as far as Vermont goes. The other federal legislation to mention that could end up providing some funding nationwide is the Recycling and Composting Accountability Act. And this is a bipartisan piece of legislation that was introduced in March, and it's already passed through the Senate committee. So it's going to be headed toward the Senate floor soon. And the reason why this bill, there's a couple of reasons why this bill is interesting. One is that it's bipartisan. The Compost Act, so far we have not succeeded in having any Republican co-sponsors because it's perceived in this highly partisan atmosphere as a Democratic initiative. This one was co-sponsored by both parties. So this one has a good chance of getting some traction. But what this bill does, the bottom line is it charges EPA with collecting data on both recycling and composting infrastructure needs, among a bunch of other things, but relevant to today is collecting data on what the needs are in our country, which would imply that there will be some money coming after that in the executive budget for infrastructure needs. So there's just so much happening right now that it's a really good time for us. There's going to be some national money coming somewhere. And I know that the infrastructure bill that passed actually did have some funds that is coming through EPA. I think I saw Ilana is on this call, and I don't know if she's comfortable to tell us anything, but I think there's going to be some funds coming in that direction as well. So just summarizing, not every one of these things, I'm not going to go through them all, but I wanted to tell you this is just a snapshot of what Laurel's white paper has in it, which is looking at each financing vehicle that we described and describing the pros and the cons of those vehicles. So that is in the paper. She did make some recommendations in it, and one of the ones she recommended was that USCC do some work in some industry resources for compost manufacturers that they can use when they go to the bank to teach bankers what our industry, what their business does. So that is something that we're already working on or plugging into our budget for the coming year. And also to support outcomes-based financing, that emerging financing method that I mentioned earlier. And if you want to read more about some interesting programs that are starting to have the flavor of this, look at a group called Zero Foodprint. I put footprint, but it's zerofoodprint.org. And that they're working a lot in California and Colorado. And then the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, I believe, is doing a lot of work in the Northeast, maybe in your area, and the Great Lakes area. And then the other thing we all need to do, USCC and everyone, is advocate, whether it's tipping fee surcharges, whether it's the bills with the federal money. We have lots of responsibility on all of us now to speak up. We haven't been heard a lot over the last, I've been with USCC 10 years, and we complain that we're always the redheaded step person or whatever it's called. And now is our time when people are finally listening to us. So with that, I do want to acknowledge, as I mentioned, Laurel. And so for her finance paper that I mentioned, that is, we have a executive summary on the website, and then we have a full paper at compostingcouncil.org/grow-your-business. And what I've arranged, I set up today, and I hope it works. Email me if it doesn't, but if you want to take a 1-month test membership at USCC because you can't get to that full paper, you can click there and sign up, and it'll last till May 31st. So you can take a look at the paper and you can try out other things with USCC. And then at the bottom of the slide also, which I think you'll probably all get these recordings or proceedings or whatever, is the link for the work that the ILSR has done, which is really excellent on the surcharge issue. So I think with that, I wasn't watching my time. I hope I haven't gone way over, Natasha, but
no, you're perfect.
Okay, but I am open for questions, and I'm sure they're coming in the chat, but I haven't really been able to monitor. So
Yeah, no worries. And thank you so much, Linda. And I should have said at the very beginning, the Composting Association of Vermont has been a member of USCC for 4 years now, I believe. And it's been really great. It's been a great way for us to really plug in to the national arena, and then also to a vehicle for amplifying and bringing Vermont's experiences, there as well. So it's a two-way information street, which has been fabulous. One just very specific question was you had referenced a company on the outcomes-based financing slide that was Quantum something, and I didn't quite remember it enough to put it, but if you can just remind us what that was.
Quantified Ventures.
Quantified Ventures. Thank you so much.
I don't have their URL, but I did jot down that's who they were. And I think she references them in the paper as well.
Great.
And I saw that Alana saved me on the NAICS code. Thank you for typing in what that means, North American Industry Classification System.
Yep. And Dan just dropped the Quantified Ventures URL in the chat. And so we are recording this just so folks know, and we'll be linking out just next to the recording on the Composting Association of Vermont's website, direct link, so you can just click them, because the recordings obviously you can't click. So I'll go through and make sure we've captured all of those. Yeah, so we have a small enough group now, I think, here that if you want to unmute and ask questions, feel free. Otherwise, you can just type them right into chat. And if we start talking over each other, I'll try to insert a little bit of order. But if you do have any questions for Linda, feel free. While you all are thinking on that, I just wanted to add a couple quick things. So I do know, in terms of some of the NRCS Vermont funding, I'm working with Joe Buford from NRCS Vermont on an on-farm composting project that we've just started recently at the association. And that is actually funded by a USDA Rural Utilities grant. And so we're sort of, using those grant funds to support establishment of community-based on-farm composting. But we've pulled Joe in, and we are going to be holding what we're calling a compost tea talk on it'll be a series of all different kinds of topics. But Joe is going to be presenting on some NRCS funding initiatives in Vermont, and is really looking for folks to get engaged there. I also just wanted to share that I know, at least within Vermont, that there are some farms that I've worked with who have successfully received working lands grants to support development of development of some composting infrastructure. Chuck Worcester at Sunrise Farm is the most recent one that I know of, and he is actually now a medium-sized certified compost facility in the state of Vermont. And so many of the other ones I know of are actually quite smaller, more community scale sized, but which I'm happy if anyone's interested to share some of that information. But those are some initial ones that I know of. So it's a quiet, shy group.
That's great news about the NRCS, because we've been interviewing as many of the states as I could get to so far, just to find out. And a lot of the states are kind of hanging back because the national NRCS is going to be publishing in the Federal Register for comment a national program. And you know how that goes. It'll probably be in there for 6 months, and we won't see it until the end of the year. But anyway, they're kind of hanging on and not really promoting their programs.
Yeah. And actually, that was one of this initiative was one of the reasons that Joe got involved in our project, and is actually sitting on the steering committee, because he's trying to really figure out what the needs are and where NRCS can sort of provide the most leverage for composting. And so he's really trying to learn from our community as they try to figure out what this might look like.
Hi, Natasha.
Yeah, Sunny, go ahead. I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I just want to introduce myself. I'm studying international education and policy, and can I ask all of you, the attendees, and Linda's opinion, say in Rupert, Vermont, and say right now we need a lot of people to research on the details and the process and the new way of educating and the financing and all of the sectors. And is it possible to have experts here to have an academy of compost, but not the name is Academy of Compost, but a academy, and then that for the parents, for the stakeholder, for the communities in Vermont can participate in these, less likely to do international study, traveling, business, but in a safe surrounding, finding the grants that they receive, stay in the state, stay in the community. For example, in Rupert, the population now is, lower, but there is a Burr and Burton Academy, and there are a lot of intelligent young people and need their employment opportunities. So what I'm saying here is it's possible for experts here to raise the fund that is like a seeding fund. It's not asking the young people to do whole fundraising ventures. And so they get the land, like say there is 130 acres now, but they offer like say before May 11th. But I believe there are some other lands available, but we don't know how to do those things with government about what kind of size of academy, school, site development, not for traditional subjects of broad, complicated subjects, but more about prioritize current, already over-addressed importance of basic fundamental and need to be repaired before other good product, food, drinking water, and the defense and the safety of town people that need for making good product, and then delivery and the business of delivery and hiring local people and securely loving the local products, and in a system that even we don't know what type of name of categories regenerating or sustainability or circular economy. But then we can actually by current common household doable range of fund input, say each person 1,000 to start. And then we also receive the matching grant from the state. And we also promise, I don't know if you set up a trust or you set up a, revolving, even like a credit union type that can invest in local sectors, the other existing vendors, providers, that they can have expectation of a growth of a business and participation. Because right now, the compost can already commercialize the heat and other byproducts, which are very good. And also the IP and also, sorry, I have so many ideas I cannot finish applying for the patents in the process in my years of life. But I'm happy that if I can see compost company associate CAV set up not just a donation of a fund, but idea hubs. So I'm sure that we researchers, graduate school students, faculties, we don't have the time to actualize those, but we don't want to hold those ideas. And we can let each sector of other people and the local families to see the idea and the drawing and the process and to put a fund with you, or you have a new way of the financial strength that toward to the entire soil, water, and agriculture and the personnel. People need to work on something they can guarantee. They have a work, they have a place to sleep, they are not being put into employments, and then they become houseless.
Yeah. So Sunny, thank you so much. And Linda, I have some thoughts or resources, but I just wanted to see if you wanted to respond first. Thanks. Or if you want me to take a first go.
Yeah, let me hear what you have to say, because I'm not sure if I understood totally the question. So
yeah, and so I think Sunny, from what I understand, you're talking about something quite a bit broader than just a composting initiative. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Vermont Farm to Plate Network. I think some of what you're talking about would actually fit very well into discussions that are happening there. And so I think what you're asking is a little bit broader than what we can really address in this session today. But I hear what you're saying, and I do know that within the farm to plate community, where traditionally for the first 10 years, they were really focused on the food system and all the different parts of the food system. But these ideas of fair wages and housing and all of these sort of more, like a fuller picture of supporting the people who are contributing to our communities needs to be factored in and supported. And in this current 10 years, we've just started on the second sort of decade of farm to plate network here in the state. And I know that they are tackling some of those broader issues, and that's a really good community of practice and sort of thought bank, if you will, for lack of a better way of saying it, to address some of those issues. I did want to actually sort of refocus the conversation just a little bit to a comment that Alex put in chat that ties maybe a little bit into this in terms of asking what people's feelings are on fair wages for compost work, whether it's in the hauling, manufacturing, or manufacturing of compost, or a combination. And you can see that this is something that is a recurring theme, I think, right now in our state, Linda. And that's just a sort of an open question, but Linda, if you want to maybe have first comment.
I think the only general thing that I can say about that, when we get the results of our economics study back, I think we'll have a better idea of the wage range across the whole industry. But I do know, and we have a very, very infant, I will say, humbly, diversity, equity, and inclusion effort ongoing in USCC. And we are trying to address, it isn't necessarily straight to the wages of the small scale composter, but we are trying to address their accessibility to programs that would elevate their businesses and elevate, I would hope, their wages. Because we've been told that that's the sector that is struggling the most in terms of being paid fully for their value. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. And I will just add that one of the things that we talk about a lot is how many more jobs are created and are needed to support organics diversion. And actually, within the hauling and the education and the processing, and then the use of compost when compared to, to landfilling or incineration. But again, that doesn't really address the fair wage piece. So does anyone else want to comment? And Sunny, I will circle back to you in just a minute. But does anyone else have comments that they'd like to add about this conversation? All right, so Sunny, I also just wanted to, I think I really appreciate your input, and I think we were just getting a little bit stretched a little bit away from today's topic in this session, but I'm happy to follow up with you as well offline and sort of noodle on your idea of Academy a little bit more. When you first said Academy, James McSweeney, who some of you on the call probably know, is starting his 131 School of Composting, I think is what it's called. And that is sort of a community of practice and education around composting specifically. But if I was understanding you correctly, Sunny, you were talking about something much broader.
Can I just kind of make a very brief refocus what I said?
Sure.
Beside the 131, like a nonprofit organization or in the past, most of us receive the compost is like industrial image, but I think now it's so mature to be academical, but in a working co-op environment. You know, like so. All of what we talk about in this week or the past years, and now also have like a global other buyers of any ideas or model or any products and package of these things. That enough for the financial subject to stay in the academy. That doesn't restrict the entry level of what's a prerequisite or age or what you studied before, but what you will do in this co-op of say 40 credits at a different time. Even you are working at say somebody working remotely or locally in Middlebury co-op market, but related to support to the compost or good soil. Just put everything, be more creative instead of an industrial concept or separate subject. And so the financial matters can be discussed and actualized by the group effort when all of you talk to the other group entity. And I think that they can see the lasting impact, because this kind of thing isn't different from the other products. These kind of things need a size of land, need a place to store the equipment, need maybe 10 years to see a better soil result, but it's worth it because once it's established correctly and researched academically, mathematically right, majorly right, instead of common household just making anything similar and with the names of a compost. This kind of infrastructure type of academy, I think, is urgently needed to restore the fundamental health of the service or business sector of the state.
Yeah, so a couple things. So Linda has shared a couple things in chat in terms of the zero footprint model for raising funds through small upcharge on restaurant bills, for example. And then Rust Belt Riders, in Ohio is an employee-owned model. I've also dropped in two, I actually invited these two groups to speak at VORS, and they, for a variety of reasons, were not available this week, but I am going to be hosting them at a future webinar. And that's CERO, the Cooperative Energy Recycling and Organics, and then Global Village Farms. And those are two cooperative organizations in Massachusetts, actually. And part of my interest there is they do have, well, you know, for a lot of reasons, but they do represent this cooperative model that we don't see, or that I haven't seen a whole lot of in Vermont. But there is a lot of, there's a lot of micro scale and sort of to small scale community composting work that is happening in the state that our association is a part of. I don't know in terms about fundraising, you know, specifically to support other spinouts, but I do think that there are some very interesting cooperative models that we could look at a little bit more and, you know, think about importing kind of to Vermont. I do want to give other folks a chance who are still with us in the room. If you have anything you want to add from your points of view, or questions that you had about the different, you know, funding structures or funding initiatives. And Alex, I know you're still on. Did we answer your question, or was there something you wanted to add to the fair wages conversation?
Well, I'm just a curious hauler coming from a very small startup standpoint.
Yeah.
And I guess I was just curious of like what the range was. I haven't done my own research or called other companies to see what's out there, but it's tough when it's not a nationally recognized business. I know it's booming in a lot of different places right now, which gives me a lot of hope and confidence, but from where I'm standing in New Hampshire, it's taking a little bit.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, Alex, you work you're out of New Hampshire, but you do a lot of partnership and working across the border here in Vermont, right?
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
I met the people at Wyndham Solid Waste Management District through my New Hampshire hauling job. So that was pretty neat.
Yeah. So a couple places that I know of in terms of funding at that smaller scale, Alex, is the New England Grassroots Environmental Fund. NEGEF. I don't know if you're familiar with them, and I'm not sure that they, specifically support. I don't know if they do small grants for businesses, but I think they would if there's a community sort of service benefit. I've worked with them in the past to support community scale composting in Vermont. And then in Vermont, and these are Vermont, which is where, I know the Vermont organizations much better than New Hampshire, although I'm starting to learn my way around New Hampshire a little bit. But we also have the Community Resiliency Organization, where, and again, it's a little bit different, and it's focused on community organizations, but many of those end up spinning into businesses and services that are supporting environmental sort of climate adaptation resiliency efforts. And so I'm happy to chat with you offline as well a little bit more and make introductions if that would be helpful to those organizations. There's also the Vermont Community Fund that I know specifically have some small grant opportunities specifically for the Brattleboro area for Windham County, which we actually leveraged to create that. They were one of the partners in the backyard and community scale training center that is up at Windham Solid Waste Management District now. They help support that. So those are just some ideas. But in terms of what is considered a fair wage, I think that's going to vary quite a bit throughout Vermont, and certainly when you cross borders and when you go broader nationally, what that means is I think you're going to see quite a wide range of what is considered a fair or livable wage.
Thanks. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful. And again, I'm happy to work with you, after the summit to make any of those connections or help you think about how you could sort of position yourself to fit into some of those programs.
Yeah, definitely. I really do appreciate it. And this summit has been absolutely amazing. And thank you for, making it so affordable for all of us.
Yeah. Well, thanks to our sponsors for that, because we definitely are able to offer this full week of content for free with their support, as well as this support from ANR. Any other specific questions around this, or while we have Linda bringing sort of the national scale and just, I personally find it really valuable to hear and learn, from those case studies, what else is happening, because we can, then I feel like I can cherry pick, oh, that's a great idea from here, and let me cobble this together with this other thing. And what I see in the folks I work with in our state, that's a lot of what happens. Nothing is quite right for Vermont, but we can grab these little ideas and put them together in a way that makes sense for us and our communities. Yeah, and also maybe when I do, the folks at both Cerro and Global Village Farms were very interested in sharing their models and telling their stories. They're both BIPOC led organizations as well. And so maybe I'll just share out through the whole VORS network whenever I pull that together, because I think their stories, they're amazing folks doing really great work, and their stories are really compelling. And again, it's that cooperative model that is, there are a couple, certainly there, it's not a brand new model, but within the organic management world and the composting world in Vermont, I think it's a different sort of spin on that. Anything else from anyone else? I have a couple slides I'm just going to throw up. If anyone here is getting U.S. Composting Council Continuing Ed credit, which is a fabulous opportunity for a lot of our participants, You can download the form if you don't have it already from our website there. And the code for this session is TASTY. So we're doing the code method for getting you guys your CE. So just fill out that form and put in that code if you participated in this session, and you'll get that credit. And thanks to USCC for partnering with us in that way. Just quick promos tomorrow morning. And this does, interestingly, it was interesting to hear you, Linda, talk a little bit about that outcomes-based impact bonds for essentially payment for ecosystem services. This is something that our state has had a working group around for the past year and a half, I think, or maybe they're just starting their second year, somewhere in the middle of their second year. That's at 10 a.m. tomorrow. So we're going to be hearing about what has been going on there and where it's been landing and how soil health and compost is fitting into that conversation. And then at 1 p.m., we're hearing from the Agency of Agriculture, the ins and outs of on-farm composting. And some of this is going to be revolving around Act 41, which passed last session, which sort of solidifies food residual composting on farms as an agricultural activity. But they are also going to be talking about some invasive species and the invasive jumping worms that are becoming a bigger problem. So there'll be a lot of sort of a mix of regulatory technical details, as well as potentially we might get into some specific funding opportunities through ag to specifically support on-farm composting. And then separate registration, then just the full online program, we're doing individual registrations for our in-person events. Tomorrow at 3:30 is an in-person tour of the Lamoille Soil Compost Facility with Lamoille Regional Solid Waste Management District. That's up in Johnson. If any of you have not been up there to tour it, and if you're local, meaning within Vermont, New Hampshire, sort of our neck of the woods, it's a really great place. It's a smaller scale compost facility, but they've done a lot with it there, and it's always nice to go in person and see different models. So I'd welcome you. You can still register for that if you'd like. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say, but I've seen mostly thank yous and not extra questions. Linda, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your expertise and USCC's expertise. I really like how USCC has broken down the different barriers. And we've been, last year we heard about zoning, and we're sort of continuing to learn along with the National US Composting Council. So that's been a great privilege.
Thanks for the work you do here in Vermont. It's great.
Yeah, and thanks to all the participants for coming and participating in this session, and for your comments and questions. And again, I just extend myself. I'm really happy to follow up with any of you on some of these other ideas offline. So feel free to reach out. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll close there.